Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to begin our lecture series on the Civil War, the actual start of the Civil War. And so, Lincoln gets elected. South Carolina immediately leaves the Union. And we're going to see, 10 other states follow within relative short order. And so, once the states leave, there then becomes a question like, what is it? Can they legally leave? Can that actually happen? And there's always kind of been a movement for a secessionist movement in the United States since its creation, right? The Hartford Convention, during the War of 1812, because of yeah, the idea of the War of 1812, a lot of Northern business leaders had talked about leaving. So it's not just the South. You see South Carolina with the Tariff of Abominations previously wanted to leave the Union as well. And so the real question is, what made up the Union, and because that will really determine whether or not you have the right to leave the Union. And so the South believes it's the states that made up the Union, that the states had sent delegates to create the Constitution, and it was the states that had to ratify the Constitution. So if the states created it, then the states can leave it if they want. The North says no, that this is the people created the Union. And so the people of the United States spoke and created a union of states, and that union is indivisible, which means it cannot be divided up. And so the North will hold on to that idea, and this is what the Civil War. Do the states have the right to leave? Now, some people claim that this is what the war is really all about. It is, and it's not. It is really about slavery. Why do they want to leave? Well, they want to leave because they want to be able. They feel slavery is under threat. That's not the only reason they want to leave. It's the major reason, but not the only one. They're also upset about tariffs. They're upset about Northern abolitionists messing around in the South, which that also is about slavery. But there's a number of reasons. But the South says, look, we don't like this. This union isn't working out for us, and they decide to leave. The South leaves. They will set up what will be known as the Confederacy. That's going to be led by this guy right here, Jefferson Davis. Meanwhile, the North, which is still the United States, is going to be led by Abraham Lincoln. These two guys really can't be much more different. Lincoln, who is widely considered the best president we've ever had. He's I hate to go back and analyze psychologically historical figures, because that's misleading, because you just can't do that unless you're there with them and know them. You can't accurately do that. But by all estimations, Lincoln's probably a genius. He's very, very intelligent, but on paper doesn't really look so good. Doesn't have, no formal schooling. Pretty much taught himself, which I think goes to show how smart he is, because he was able to do that by himself. He's got very limited military experience. He spent some time in the militia and actually was god awful, and just so doesn't have deep understanding, practical experience within the military. Now, when the war breaks out, he's going to study strategy and actually conceptually really kind of understand strategy pretty well, but doesn't have that experience, successful experience of leading troops, although he did for a very short time. He was congressman for one term, and not nothing super important happened. Doesn't have a lot of political clout in that arena, and he doesn't have the full backing of the North. There are Northern Democrats who oppose this war, and there's lots of people in the North that just think, let the South do their thing. We're fine without them, and so he's always going to be having to deal with trying to fight a war and unite the North politically. That's a very difficult thing to do. Jefferson Davis, on the other hand, he's a graduate of West Point, which is one of the premier, universities in the country. It's a military university. So, not only are you getting a superb education from West Point, you're also, deeply involved in military strategy and learning the ins and outs of the military. You're well connected with, all the future generals. And so, just a premier elite education for Jefferson Davis. He's got experience in the Mexican American War. So he actually does have experience leading troops, and relatively successfully. That war was very successful for the United States. Um, served as a congressman, and had a good career there. Has much better connections and understanding of the political process because of that, and spent time as Secretary of War as well. So not only does he understand the military, he actually understands kind of more of the organizational and political side of it as well from being Secretary of War, and has essentially universal support in the South. He doesn't have to worry about a divided South. Pretty much everybody in the South is on board with leaving the Union and fighting this war. And so when Lincoln has to try and fight a war and convince the public that the war is the right thing to do, and he's got opponents that are constantly trying to make things difficult for him, that's a very difficult thing to do. Jefferson Davis doesn't have that. He's got essentially complete support from his people, and so it's going to be easier for him to be able to kind of get the political support that he needs. Even though he's got the political support, Lincoln has more of the industrial support. But we've talked about that in previous lectures. The industrial and output of each side. The North by far has an advantage there. So on paper, when you look at these two guys, it looks like Jefferson Davis is probably going to be the better leader, and that the South has an opportunity to set up a better government. That's not going to be the case. Lincoln is going to just kind of, I mean, he's going to be the great uniter, and he's going to be able to take a lot of his political rivals and actually make them some of his staunchest allies. He does that with his cabinet. We talked about William Seward and how Lincoln beat William Seward for the nomination for the Republican Party. William Seward ends up becoming one of his closest friends. And confidants. He's able to unite the party eventually. And, even though there's, all the way up to Gettysburg, he's going to have a real struggle uniting the North, but he's going to be able to accomplish it. And so it's just this absolutely just massive feat. So the first crisis he's going to have to deal with, President Lincoln really kind of wants to. He doesn't want to be the first to attack, and the South has declared themselves their own country, and he kind of just sits back and is like, "We're gonna hope that everything settles and the South changes their mind." Kind of attitude, and so he says, "Hey, we're going to continue to maintain our forts," but he puts everybody on like a wait and see kind of stance. And so, he really is trying to do. He recognizes that several different things. One, for his own political consumption in the North, he doesn't want to look like the aggressor. Since there are some people that aren't supporting this war, if he looks like the aggressor, it's more likely that those people will staunchly oppose the war. There's something else that's even more important. The one advantage that the South does have is cotton. Well, they've got several advantages. Generals are an advantage too, but one of the material advantages that the South has is cotton, and which is in high demand in Europe. And so Europe really wants to side with the South economically. Now, Europe has by this point already gotten rid of slavery. And so, the government of Europe wants to side with the South. The people of Europe don't want to side with the South because they don't want to support slavery. And so they're kind of mixed about it. But at the end of the day, England, who is, who the South is kind of courting to be their ally, the English economy is mostly built on the textile industry, which is making clothes, which cotton is super important for that. And so the England is looking for an excuse to side with the South, and Lincoln knows if he attacks the South first, that makes him look like the bad guy, and might, the key word is might here, might give Europe an opportunity to say, oh, the North attacked the South, and we're just going to step in and protect these innocent people that were attacked. He don't want to be in that situation. So he doesn't want to attack first. You got to understand that to understand what happens at Fort Sumter. Well, at Fort Sumter, which is in Charleston, South Carolina, Major Robert Anderson holds the fort, and Anderson's like really smart. He recognized like, oh crap, we're in Southern Territory. But I work for the Union Army, the American Army, right, the Northern Army, and he sees that, oh, I'm in hostile territory. I don't want there to be an incident. I don't want to be the guy that causes the spark that ignites this flame. And so he calls in all of his troops, and he says, all right, we're going to head back into the fort and we're going to bunker down. Well, when he does that, the South surrounds Fort Sumter, right? They need those forts. They need the equipment in it. They need, they're going to have their own army because they're their own country now, and so they want to take over the American military bases there, the Union military bases there. And so, Anderson hunkers down, and the South surrounds him. Now, the South really doesn't want to fire the first shot either for similar reasons. And so, but they got to have the fort. And so they have to have the fort. Well, Lincoln recognizes Anderson doesn't have enough supplies to last forever. And so he's got a couple options. Either he can send his army down and try and destroy the Southern militias that have essentially surrounded the fort, or he can just send a cargo ship and hope it doesn't get stopped. And so what he decides to do is just to send the supplies. So he's going to try to resupply the fort. Well, the South can't have that, right? If they're ever going to control, they can't have the North controlling military bases in their own territory. And so Lincoln sends the supplies and says, hey, we don't want to attack you. We just want to make sure these people have enough food to eat. And then the South does what is inevitable, what they have to do. They can't allow those supplies to come in. And so the Confederates are going to open fire. Major Anderson, is going to have to give up the fort, right? I mean, he's surrounded and he doesn't have enough troops. So this is kind of like the first loss for the North, and there's going to be a lot of losses for the North. But it's actually a win for the North. It's a win for the Union because the North is no longer has to worry about being the aggressor. The South fired the first shot. There's no casualties, right? They're not killing anybody. They're attacking the fort, but nobody's going to die. But the South is now the aggressor, which is plays into Lincoln's hands because it's going to be domestically good for political consumption. Hey, they attacked us first. We didn't attack them. We're not the aggressor. And they get to send that same message to Europe as well. If Great Britain decides to side with the South, then all that advantage of industrial production that the North has, that the fact that they can build more guns and bullets and all that kind of stuff and grow more food than the South does because you can't eat cotton. If Great Britain decides to help the South, that advantage completely disappears. And so this is kind of a really great political win for Lincoln. Now, the North has to come up with a battle plan, and so the young generals want a head-on attack. They just the capital of Washington D.C. Is capital's not in Maryland technically, but it was taken from land from Maryland, which is right next to Virginia, which is right where the capital is Richmond, which ends up becoming the capital of the South. So the two capitals are super close to each other, and so a lot of the younger Northern generals just underestimate the South completely, and they think, oh man, we could just a head-on attack into Richmond. And if we do that, we can crush them in one blow. The war will be short and sweet. And so, that's what we should do. Now, this guy right here, General Winfield Scott, who's older and kind of, on the outs, just because he's older, he thinks, well, let's not be so quick, right? We're fighting the South. Some of the best generals in the entire American military. You look at, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, General Longstreet. Those are like three of the best generals that America might have ever had. And so, these guys know what they're doing, and they're very good, and they're very professional. The South will be fighting on their own turf, and they're very, very motivated to fight. And Winfield Scott says maybe this isn't the best idea, and so he comes up with a plan called Anaconda. And Anaconda's got several parts. You can see in the Scott's great snake, his plan there. You know what an anaconda is known for? It's a constrictor, right? It's a gigantic snake. The northern industrial complex is gigantic. The northern military is gigantic. The northern population is gigantic. And what he says is we need to use that to our advantage. And what we should do is, just like a snake, we should just wrap up our enemy and just strangle them, squeeze them. The South can't grow enough food to feed all their people. They've used all that land. It's growing cotton. And although they will take some of that land and start to use it for food production, what they really want to do is just sell the cotton to Europe and use it to buy the things that they need. Um, so he says what you got to do is blockade the coast to cut off any help from Europe, and to cut off any trade. And so that cotton all of a sudden now is not sellable. Well, you can't, if you can't sell the cotton, you also, can't eat the cotton. And so, that's going to essentially starve the South. What you then need to do as well, though, is you need to make sure that you capture and control the Mississippi. If you capture the Mississippi, that will do two things. It's going to make it much harder to trade, because if you can move, you're able to get crops out of Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana relatively easily, and then trade with the rest of the world. So if you can cut off, and particularly if you could control New Orleans, you could cut that off. But the other thing that it does, it's going to cut, if you control the Mississippi, you cut the Confederacy in half, the Southern military, Southern government in half. And so all of a sudden now Arkansas, Louisiana, and most importantly, Texas are now out of the fight. And so that ends up being a huge thing. And so control the Mississippi, blockade the coast, and then essentially invade the Deep South and cut them in half, what is essentially a second time. But you don't invade until after you've weakened them by cutting off their supplies, making sure they're not getting any guns, any ammo, any food, or anything like that. So that's his plan. The problem with that plan and why it gets rejected initially is because it's going to take time, right? If you're going to blockade somebody and weaken them, you have to you have to take a long time for them to run out of food and to get weak in that way. And the young generals are just going to say, nope, we can end this in one blow. And so a head on attack to Richmond is what we're going to do. And that's what will happen initially. Eventually, Winfield Scott's Anaconda plan is what we'll use, right? And when particularly when Grant takes over, we're going to see that, the Anaconda, we're going to divide, we're going to cut the Confederacy off from the West. We'll eventually control New Orleans and cut off trade with the Mississippi River, and then that's when we're going to go after Lee in the East. So, battle plan for the South. Really pretty simple. Make it a defensive war, right? Fight on Southern territory, territory that they know, that the soldiers know really well. Make sure you pick the location that best suits a good defense, and have the Union attack you. And so what we're going to see is until Grant eventually takes over and really goes after Lee, and that's going to be quite some time down the road. The South is always going to have the better ground. They're going to essentially wait for the Union to make a move, for the North to make a move, and then they'll pick the battleground. They'll generally take the high ground, which gives them a key advantage. When you're trying to attack the high ground and run up a hill, when you're shooting, typically you end up shooting high. It's hard to hit your target. Shooting down, you're going to be a little bit more accurate, and generally have something to hide behind. And so that's going to be a key advantage. You're going to see Lee really is up until the very end is going to be almost unbeatable in the South. It's when he extends out of the South into Antietam and Gettysburg where he's going to suffer some pretty serious losses. They just got to wait him out. And so that's the key. We've talked about this in previous lectures, and we'll talk about it in future lectures. The key to beating America in war is not defeating our military strength. Particularly in modern times, that's almost impossible to do. Particularly today. But we are very defeatable, and it's because we're a democracy. And democracy, if the war goes on long enough and enough people die, the people just won't vote to continue to support the war. And so that's essentially what the South's plan is going to be. We're just going to hold on because we have a stronger will to fight. We're going to hold on until the people of the North decide to quit and vote out guys like Lincoln that won't quit. And so, just fight long enough to erode the Northern voters' support for the war, and hopefully get foreign aid because of cotton. Right, cotton is king in the South, and they know it is super important for the European economies. And so if they hold out long enough, and if even if the blockade works, eventually the European economies will be starved of cotton, and their economies will be hurt so bad that they might feel like they have to get involved. Now, that won't work out because Egypt is going to increase cotton production in the Nile Valley. And so there will be an alternative source of cotton for Europe, but the South can't know that that's about to happen. And so they're hoping that the desire for cotton is going to bring in allies. Now, the first battle that we're going to see is going to be at the First Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run. The South is going to call it First Manassas. The North is going to call it the First Battle of Bull Run. That's how I'll be referring to it. It's the first major battle of the war. Both sides think it's going to be an easy and quick victory. The South thinks that, even though they're outnumbered, the Union's got about 35,000 troops. The Confederacy has about 20,000 troops. So the North has a numerical advantage. But the North is coming into Southern territory, and they're headed down to Richmond, and the South is going to have some good ground to fight from, and so both sides kind of think that because of the fact that the South has they're fighting on their own territory, they have better generals than the North because they have so many more troops. Both sides think it's going to end quickly. As a matter of fact, what happens is when it becomes clear that the two armies are going to meet out in the hillside, the local population is going to come out and have essentially set up a picnic to try and watch this battle. They think they're going to be watching history happen. They think they're going to be they are, but not the history they think. They think they're going to see the start and finish of this war all done in one battle. And so everybody thinks the war is going to end after this battle. So the Union troops are trying to attack Richmond head on and end it quickly. And the two sides meet up at the First Battle of Bull Run. McDowell is the guy that is in charge of the Union forces, and he is overly cautious. He really thinks that the South has more troops than they do. And we're going to see that this is going to be an ultimate failing of the Union military in this entire war. They're going to have scouts and military intelligence overestimating the numbers of Confederate soldiers all the way through this war. I mean, all the way up until Grant takes over, and Grant just sees through that. So because of that, General McDowell, who's in charge, is super cautious and moves super slow. And because he moves super slow, General Beauregard, who's in charge for the South, Lee's not in charge yet. Lee's been put in charge of the defense of Virginia. As a matter of fact, they're giving him, making fun of him because he's out there digging trenches and in the South. Like that's like, beneath the gentleman to be doing that. So Beauregard's going to have enough time to prepare because McDowell is so afraid of being ambushed by a superior force. And because of that, Beauregard is able to get reinforcements to build up his troops. Eventually, the Union will attack. When they do, things are going good initially, but one of the up and coming generals, Stonewall Jackson, gets his nickname Stonewall in this battle, keeps his men in formation under overwhelming odds, stands up to give his men courage, stands up under fire, where one of his troops reportedly says, "Look at Jackson there standing like a stone wall." He is incredibly brave, which eventually get him killed in this war. But he stands there, rallies his troops. He doesn't break, and because of that, eventually the Confederate troops will be able to rally and outflank the Union, and which means just coming around the side and attacking from the side. It's going to shock the Union. They're going to be terrified, and so if this army is destroyed, there's really not much between the Confederate army and Washington D.C. And so what will happen is the North will essentially skedaddle back to Washington, and so they're going to turn around and run. Now, Beauregard essentially lets the Northern Army leave the battlefield, and he doesn't really pursue. And so, because of that, the South misses an opportunity, which is a good thing for the North. About 3,000 Union casualties will come out of this war. About 1,700 Confederate casualties. And so the big flaw here, the lesson that should have been learned that won't be learned from the Union troops, is that being overly cautious is not a good thing. If you give the South time to prepare, your numbers advantage means much less. Beauregard probably shouldn't have let the Union troops escape. But the one lesson that I think everybody learns, the South, the North, the political leadership, and the people learn from the first Battle of Bull Run, is that this war will not be a quick war. So what will happen is, because General McDowell was overly cautious and loses, he will be replaced by a man known as the Young Napoleon. He's known. He's got one of the best reputations in the Union military and the Northern military, from his time at West Point. He's not really actually accomplished anything super significant, but he strikes himself as the next Napoleon, a great European general and emperor and conqueror. And that's George McClellan. George McClellan will absolutely be loved by his troops. He's a great organizer. He trains the military exceptionally well. He makes sure that, after the defeat, when he gets put in charge, he's going to make sure everybody is, one of the complaints that the Union soldiers had is when they went to go fight, they weren't prepared well enough. That the average soldier, felt like they didn't have the right boots and the right equipment or enough training. And McClellan, when he takes over, he's gonna whip them into shape. He is gonna train them exceptionally well. He's gonna make sure that they are well equipped, that they have all the equipment that they need. And because of that, the Union troops are gonna love him even after he has some losses under his belt. So he will be given command of the Army of the Potomac. The Army of the Potomac is the main fighting force for the Union military, for the Northern military. It's not the only fighting force, but it is going to be the main fighting force that's going to be fighting in the East, right, where everybody considers to be like the most important battles. I would argue that that's probably not necessarily true. But because the capitals are there, I think the focus is always on the East Coast. He is definitely overly cautious. We will see time and time again he loses because he gives the South, and particularly Robert E. Lee, who's probably one of the greatest military geniuses in American history. He gives him too much time to prepare. And the one thing you can never do with Robert E. Lee is give him time to prepare. That's why eventually the guy that's going to defeat Robert E. Lee definitively is going to be Grant, who just keeps attacking. Even when he loses, he just keeps attacking. McClellan, on the other hand, he's going to be so terrified of losing that he's going to just inch forward in the attack against the South, giving Lee enough time to prepare. So, lesson here: troops love him because he's treating them really well. Lincoln will just become incredibly frustrated with him because of how overly cautious he is and how that over cautiousness results in losses. But because he's so loved by the troops, Lincoln's going to have a hard time getting rid of him. This is Robert E. Lee. This is the right here, Robert E. Lee from the Civil War, the older version of Robert E. Lee, who is ultimately loved by his troops. I mean, his troops, he almost by the end of the war has this like mythic status with his troops that they'll literally do anything for him. I mean, some of the troops the Southern troops they're going to be in a bad state by the end of the war because they just don't have enough food or boots. I mean, there's going to be soldiers without shoes that are fighting that just refuse to give up because they have that much faith in Robert E. Lee. If you take a look at his younger picture, he looks shockingly like Robert Downey Jr. and Iron Man, right? It's crazy. Iron Man's a time traveler. Just kidding. So Robert E. Lee will, like I said, during the first Battle of Bull Run, he's going to be left to, defend Richmond. He was offered a spot in the Union military. I mean, everybody, the Union, we really wanted him. Lincoln really wanted him to stay and fight. And he's got mixed feelings about the war. He's got a mixed stance on slavery, but ultimately he can't imagine going and fighting his fellow Virginians. And so when Virginia leaves the Union, he's like, I can't fight against my home. And so decides that he's not going to fight for the Union. And so, a lot of people use that as an excuse, like, oh, Robert E. Lee is, he's not necessarily a bad guy. Oh, well, I mean, there's another option. He could have just not fought at all, right? He didn't have to, fight his homeland of Virginia. He could have just not fought for either side. But he is ultimately going to choose to fight for the Confederacy, and his argument is he's just defending his homeland, and he will eventually be put in control of the Army of Virginia. Which is the primary army of the Confederacy. So, and when he takes over, it will just be a series of victories against overwhelming odds. And this is why his soldiers will love him so much. That he's always outnumbered, but he's going to figure out a way, to continue to win, and so his troops are going to be extremely loyal. So that leads us to the Peninsula Campaign. McClellan has taken charge. He's training his troops, but Lincoln is like wants to hurry up the attack, and he's like, come on, we can't just train forever. We got to go. We got to attack. We got to take the initiative. We have more people. We have more guns. We have more supplies. And the longer we wait to fight, the more prepared the South is going to be, the more they're going to be able to dig in their defenses. And so Lincoln kind of is putting pressure on McClellan to go. McClellan doesn't want to go, but eventually, I mean, you don't have a choice. The president is the commander in chief. And so, eventually Lincoln puts enough pressure on McClellan that McClellan decides to attack. Now, the first Battle of Bull Run, it was a straight on attack on Richmond, right? So what we should do is the attack, it's north-south. So he was going from the north to attack Richmond in the south. Well, that didn't work. Lee, I shouldn't say Lee, Beauregard was able to intercept and stop them. And so the idea is that they're expecting another attack straight down to Richmond. And so what the North decides to do is, instead of doing that, they're going to swing around. The North has an advantage. they have an actual navy that the South is just trailing behind on. Eventually, they'll have some ironclads. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But the North has an extreme advantage in the Navy, and so what they decide to do is put their troops on ships and swing them around on the ocean, come down and land in the southern part of Virginia on a peninsula, and then attack, kind of surprise attack Richmond from the south. So instead of attacking from the north to the south, they're going to swing around and attack Richmond from the south, attacking up towards the north. And that's actually a pretty good idea. But McClellan, I told you he's cautious. And so he's going to swing around and attack from the peninsula. But when he lands on the peninsula, again, he's getting reports from his scouts and intelligence that the South has way more troops than they actually have. And so the Union is going to have 100,000 troops at this point, and the rebels, or the Confederacy, whatever you want to call them, will have about 60,000 troops. And so, McClellan has a massive advantage in troops. Massive advantage in troops. But when he lands on the peninsula, he essentially sets up camp and just inches forward up the peninsula. And so, because he moves so slow, the South, any surprise that the Union was able to get is quickly evaporated because he moves so slow. That gives the South time to react. And so, they're going to be able to swing enough Confederate troops down south to defend Richmond. And so there'll be a series of victories. What will happen is the Peninsula Campaign is not just one battle. It's a series of battles. So the first couple, the North's going to win. And so it's during this time that Lee gets actually put in charge of the Army of Virginia. And once he's put in charge, Lee is going to start to outsmart McClellan. He's going to start to win some victories. He's bold. He's decisive. He knows that he doesn't have as many troops as McClellan does, and he senses the timidity or the cautiousness of the Union troops. And so he's just attacking. And that is going to, in McClellan's mind, is going to be evidence that the South does have more troops than what they actually have. And so he's already believes that the South has more troops than the Union does. And when Lee starts attacking like crazy, that reinforces McClellan's belief that he's outnumbered when he's actually not, right? Because the smaller force typically would just dig in into a defensive position and wait for the larger force to attack. And that's not, Lee knows that he can't do that. The North would just steamroll him. And so Lee's going to constantly be doing things like dividing his forces against a larger opponent, which is nobody's ever done that before, and just attack and just like buzzing on gnats. Which, if when you're doing that to somebody who's timid, it causes them to, become afraid and back down. And so, because he works so slowly, Lee's going to be able to solidly defeat McClellan, and McClellan's going to have to retreat. But when he retreats, Lincoln fires him. Like, when it's all over, we realize that McClellan had 100,000 troops, and Lee never really had that. And so, McClellan's gonna say, "I was fighting 200,000 troops." It's like, no, you weren't. Like, no, you weren't. And so Lincoln is going to fire him. The troops are going to be very upset by this. The troops are still loyal to McClellan, even though he's losing, because he's treated them so well. And so here's a picture of the Peninsula Campaign. You can see the route they took to land on the peninsula, and the idea was to attack up the peninsula and into Richmond. But again, you move so slow. You're on a peninsula. You're surrounded by water on three sides. So if you land there quick and everybody's surprised and you race up that peninsula, then you might be able to surprise somebody. But if you work slowly, if you're surrounded by water on three sides, your troops only have one direction to go. And Lee used that, was able to use that to his advantage. So we've had two battles so far. First Bull Run, that's a loss for the Union. Peninsula Campaign, that's a loss for the Union. Union, you're in trouble. Right. So McClellan fires. This guy takes over. This is General Pope. And so Lincoln is hoping that Pope's going to be able to turn things around. And that will lead us to the Second Battle of Bull Run. So we're going to take another run at Richmond. And we're going to do this again by attacking straight on to Richmond. And so Pope is put in charge. McClellan, he's got his own force. He's not like fired, so he's just taken out of command of the Army of the Potomac. So he's no longer the head guy in charge. He's got his own troops. And General Pope is going to be taking on General Lee, and who, because of the first battle of Bull Run, Stonewall Jackson, who is now Lee calls him his right arm. He's his number one guy. Lee and Jackson are going to be facing General Pope. General Pope is, heads on down and is going to be again trying to attack Richmond. They're going to meet up at Manassas or Bull Run. Once again, when Pope is heading down, he is waiting for reinforcements from McClellan. McClellan, what do we know about McClellan? He's slow, he's cautious. And so as Pope is heading down, he's hoping that McClellan is going to come and reinforce him. But Lee sees that. And so when he sees that he sees Pope is coming down and that McClellan is moving to reinforce Pope, Lee, because he's bold and decisive, he recognizes, well, if those two armies combine, he's not going to have a chance. And so he, again, in another just crazy move, attacks a superior force. Pope has more troops than Lee does. And so he just goes ahead and attacks the superior force anyway, attacking Pope when Pope's not ready. And you combine that with the fact that McClellan is timid to begin with and is going to move slow. McClellan's just not going to be able to get there in time to reinforce Pope. Now, also, McClellan doesn't really want to get there to reinforce Pope. He doesn't. He just had his army taken from him. McClellan has political ambitions in the future, and he doesn't want to be. He's kind of petty. He feels like he should still be in charge, and so doesn't really want to see Pope do well. So he moves to reinforce Pope, but he moves super slow, and because of that, we're going to see another solid win for the Confederacy. Is going to be able to hold out here. Jackson is going to be able to take over supply, seize a supply depot. Again, Jackson's troops hold on. And we're going to be able to we're going to see a Confederate win here. It's at this point that Lincoln has to fire Pope for another failure, and he gives in to the even though he doesn't like McClellan, he doesn't think McClellan is his guy. The morale in the North plummets after this loss. We've got 3 losses now for the North. And to build up morale in the army, he puts McClellan back in charge. Right, the Northern soldiers just are just defeated. They feel awful. Right, that's what the morale is like. How excited are the troops to fight? Well, the Northern troops are not excited to fight now. They feel like they feel awful, and the one guy they like is McClellan. And so Lincoln recognizes he's got to make his troops happy. They have to want to fight to be able to win. And so even though he doesn't like McClellan, he's going to put McClellan back in charge. At this point, Lincoln is beginning to lose some faith, man. We've been fighting for about a year. The North just hasn't gotten any victories. He's actually going to confide to some friends that, like, we might as well just quit. The Northern generals don't want to fight. We've got all these advantages, and nobody wants to take advantage, take control and get us a victory. And he's starting to lose faith. Thank God he gets out of that. Lincoln is known for bouts of melancholy or depression. And so, he eventually works himself out of that. But he's looking for a general that wants to fight. And we've got one. And that's going to be Ulysses S. Grant. The problem is Ulysses S. Grant is not, he's not, a high-ranking, well-established, military general. He's just not. He's had kind of just born in Ohio, so he's not from like uh, some of the more politically powerful states. He's got average grades from West Point, wasn't top of his class. He's kind of had all kinds of failed business adventures. He's not a super successful guy. Doesn't look the part. I mean, all these other generals, Meade is always posing like Napoleon. He's just his uniform is always spotless, and he presents himself as this regal gentleman soldier. The Southern generals are the same way. Grant doesn't care for that. He's always kind of dirty, and his jacket's unbuttoned, and he's slovenly. His beard is never trimmed properly. He's just dirty all the time, and he didn't care about that. Because he's a fighter. I mean, truly a fighter. He just cares about winning, and so and he's going to do it in kind of a different way. He also knows that he's not smarter than Lee. He's not going to try and outsmart Lee. He understands what this war is really about. It's going to be one of the first wars of attrition, which means the first side to run out of supplies loses. He recognizes that, and he recognizes that the North has just way more people than the South, and they're getting new immigrants every day, so they can replenish their soldiers, and that we've got an industrial capacity. We're never going to run out of bullets, and we're never going to run out of food. And so he essentially says, I don't have to outsmart any Southern generals, whether it's Albert Sidney Johnson in the West, who's another really great Confederate general, or Lee in the East. He doesn't have to outsmart him. He just has to overwhelm him. And so I can lose every battle and still win the war. Because for every Union soldier you kill, I can replace them with another. For every Confederate soldier that I kill, they can't be replaced. So we might fight 10 battles and you might win 9 of them. But by the time we get to that 10th battle, you're going to be out of soldiers and I'm not. And I can win that way. I always liken it to Rocky Balboa films, right? Think about it. If you want to think of the way that Grant fights is the way that Rocky Balboa fights in Rocky movies. Rocky Balboa gets his butt kicked for every round except the last one, right? He's just tougher than his opponents. And that is Grant. He's like, I don't have to win every round to be able to win the entire fight. And so, he's going to really first establish himself at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson out west. And so these are going to be the first real victories for the Union. The rebels are holding on to Fort Henry and Fort Donelson out west. And so this battle, both of those forts are necessary. If we take those forts are located on the Cumberland River in Tennessee. And so if we could take those forts, we could control that river, which means we can shut down Confederate trade, which is part of Plan Anaconda. It's also important because Tennessee is one of those northern slave states. It's one of the slave states on the border. Kentucky, who's a slave state that right now is remaining neutral, right? They're staying in the North. Right, it's one of the border states like Missouri that is also a slave state that's not fighting, and so you see, Kentucky's looking, and if they think that the Confederacy is going to win, they'll probably switch sides. And so it's important that we get some wins in Tennessee, because if we can take Tennessee, which borders Kentucky, Kentucky's going to stay in the Union. So these are huge battles here. What Grant is going to do is he's going to attack Fort Henry first, with just overwhelming force. Fort Henry's kind of the smaller fort, and the Confederate troops will immediately retreat from Fort Henry and head to Fort Donelson. When they do that, Grant just steamrolls on, heads to Fort Donelson, is going to surround Fort Donelson that's located on the river. He's going to, bring up the Navy up the Cumberland River and essentially bombard Fort Donelson and essentially attack. And so he's using a new type of ship at this fort. It's an iron side. So the fort, if you sail a wooden ship up the Cumberland River, the fort will use their cannons to sink that wooden ship. Well, we've got new ships called Ironsides that are starting to get used. We'll talk Monitor and Merrimack later. But these Ironsides, essentially, they're wooden boats with iron plates put on the side that can withstand some cannon fire. And he's going to start to bombard Fort Donelson and essentially surrounds the fort. And when he surrounds Fort Donelson, the Confederates in charge essentially say, hey, we want to talk terms for surrender, which means what they want to do is they want to say, we'll give up the fort, but you got to let the soldiers go. And, Grant, understanding that every single Confederate soldier that he takes off of the playing field, whether we kill them or capture them, that's how you win the war. We take their soldiers away and we just continue to outnumber them. That's how we're going to win this war. He recognizes you can't do that. And so when they're like, hey, we want to talk terms of surrender, you take the fort and the weapons and we'll take our soldiers and leave. Grant says, no. There's no way we're going to do that. If you're going to surrender, you have two options. We continue fighting where I'll kill all of you, or you surrender unconditionally, which means I take the fort, I take the weapons, and if I want, I take all of your soldiers prisoner. And so, he's the first guy that's not first Union general that is not being timid. Right? He says, I'm going to take the fight to you and I'm going to attack this fort and all kinds of Union soldiers are going to die. And that's tragic. He doesn't want them to die, but he says, this is war and this is what I got to do to win. And ultimately, if I win it quickly, I'll save more lives, even if, people die in the meantime. And so, eventually, he's going to win. He's going to be able to. The South will surrender, and that will open up Tennessee to full invasion. So we're going to be able to start to, and you'll see this later, and it'll take some time, but we're going to be able to cut Tennessee in half here. Which is going to be super important because it's a first step to controlling the Mississippi River. It's going to keep Kentucky from joining the Confederacy, and it's going to give the Union some hope. Like, oh my God, we can actually win some battles here. And so Grant is able to take both of these forts and earns his nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, which is a terrible nickname, by the way. But ultimately, we're starting to get some victories out west, thanks to Grant. It's still a hot mess out east, and that is where we will pick it up in our next lecture. Thank you very much for your time.